We're continuing our sermon series, looking at stories from Luke's Gospel, where Jesus interacts with those who could be considered lowly for a variety of reasons. And today we're focusing on that short story we heard from Luke chapter 7 about the Widow of Nain. Before we dive into the passage, I'd like you to consider for a minute how you react when a funeral cortege passes by. Do you just ignore the procession, perhaps out of respect for the privacy of the family and friends in the cars, or due to your own busyness and focus on what you're doing? Or do you pause to bow or nod your head as a sign of respect to the person who has passed away and those grieving? Or would you stop for a moment to offer a prayer for the bereaved loved ones on their way to the funeral? I think I've done all of those options over the years. And in my recent experiences of travelling in funeral processions, I've also been aware of them all going on around me as we have slowly made our way along the route. But I've certainly never come across or been tempted to do what Jesus did in our passage, namely, interrupt the burial procession, tell the chief mourner to stop crying, and reach out to touch the coffin. I imagine you could be arrested for doing that in the UK in 2025, but it was definitely breaking the law in Jesus' day. And not only that, touching the bier that the corpse was being carried on would have resulted in a day's uncleanness for Jesus, according to the laws in Numbers. And if he touched the actual dead body, it was a week's uncleanness instead. But did Jesus just happen to be passing that way and bump into the funeral procession by chance? If we look at the geographical logistics, that seems highly unlikely. In the opening verses of Luke 7, we read that Jesus has been in Capernaum, where he healed the servant of a centurion without even needing to see him face to face. In the NIV, verse 11 states that the miracle we're studying happened soon afterwards. But some translations are more specific, stating it was the next day. In that time, Jesus has travelled from Capernaum to Nain. Now, in Jesus' day, Nain was a small farming village, very much off the beaten track, with access limited to a single road. Its name means pleasant, which suited the beautiful mountainous backdrop. But Nain was a relatively poor settlement, consisting, archaeologists believe, of about 34 homes, housing about 190 people. Today, it's home to about 1,500 inhabitants. Now, Capernaum is situated on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, 600 feet below sea level, whereas Nain is about 30 miles southwest of Capernaum at 700 feet above sea level. This would have been an arduous uphill climb, which today takes at least 10 hours to walk on the current paved roads, so would surely have taken longer on the uneven surface of Jesus' time. Jesus would have had to arise incredibly early, or perhaps walk through the night on such a steep road in order to intercept the burial procession. And he would have had no obvious reason to choose this route or visit this small settlement, so a chance encounter seems pretty unlikely. When we read in Luke chapter 4 about Jesus returning to Nazareth and speaking in the synagogue there, he refers to the interactions between the prophet Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, which we heard about in our first reading. He says, "I assure you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon." Similarly, Jesus is intentional in his actions too. So there is a reason for him being in Nain at just the right moment to encounter this funeral procession. Luke saw this and the importance of what transpires, so he chooses to include this story in his account, unlike the other three gospel writers. So we'd better get stuck into the passage to find out what it has to teach us. We're going to see that Jesus had eyes to see, a heart of compassion, power to transform, and hope to offer. Firstly, eyes to see. Verses 11 and 12 at the start of our passage paint the scene for us. Jesus, his disciples, and a large crowd of followers have made the arduous uphill journey we've heard about. And as they approach the town gate at Nain, they are on a collision course with another large crowd, a crowd of townspeople accompanying a widow and the body of her only son as they prepare for his burial. And the next words Luke writes are, "When the Lord saw her." Not when the Lord saw the crowd, not when the Lord saw the dead man, but when the Lord saw her. If you have time to look through Luke's gospel, it's interesting to notice the occasions when he refers to Jesus seeing people, and also how obvious it is that the writer isn't simply referring to Jesus catching sight of someone. No, when Luke talks about Jesus seeing people, he means that the Lord really saw them, saw into their situations and their needs, saw into their hearts and saw their longings. And this is because the people Luke refers to Jesus as seeing are those who are generally overlooked, rejected, and neglected, including those who people would go to lengths not to look at. Apart from the widow of Nain, the ones I spotted were the woman crippled and bent double for 18 years, the 10 leprosy sufferers, Zacchaeus, who we heard about last week, and the widow who Jesus spotted offering her last mite in the temple. Who are those who are overlooked in our society, pushed to the margins, forgotten about? What about in our circle of acquaintances, in our workplaces, amongst our neighbours, friends, or even family? We must ask God to give us eyes to see as he sees, seeing worth and value in all people and recognising their needs and longings. But seeing alone is not enough. Jesus also had a heart of compassion. Verse 13 continues, "When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her." We use that phrase quite a lot, don't we? My heart goes out to you. My heart goes out to them. It can sum things up when we don't really know what to say or how to react to what someone else is going through. But if it's actually true, as it was in the case of Jesus' reaction to the widow, then it is compassion in a nutshell. The word compassion comes from Latin, com meaning with or together, and passio meaning to feel or suffer. So to have compassion is to feel someone's pain or longing or despair with them, to suffer together with them. We see Jesus exemplifying this time and again during his ministry, and this instance is another example. For this widow, it wasn't just that she had lost her only son, which was desperate enough, but as a widow, this also meant losing her only means of financial support. Women were not able to make enough money to survive on, and there was no social security, no life insurance policy, and no pension in those days. So she knew that alongside her grief, loneliness, and desolation, she faced poverty and destitution. We see this elsewhere in the Bible, such as the famous story of Naomi and Ruth, where despite her daughter-in-law's amazing faithfulness and commitment, the women still need to rely on their kinsman redeemer Boaz to liberate them from poverty. And in the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath in our first reading, where we heard that the widow and her son were down to a handful of flour and a little olive oil and were preparing to die of starvation. And that later, when the son dies, Elijah describes this to God as a tragedy for the widow. For all these widows, the death of their sons was not only a personal tragedy, it was also a tragedy in social and economic terms. Isaiah 53 prophesies that Jesus will be a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He is able to empathize with those whose desperate situations he sees into and truly demonstrate his heart of compassion. And he didn't limit his compassion to words of comfort. No, he was rather willing to risk breaking convention and even the law, and prepared to get his hands dirty, becoming ritually unclean in his tangible acts of compassion. What about us? Are we moved by compassion, feeling together and suffering with those in desperate need? Or, if we are moved, is it more often by compulsion, because we know it's the right thing to do and what God wants of us? Our love, care, and action for others will only ever be that which is risky, sacrificial, and willing to get its hands dirty if it springs from compassion rather than compulsion. As the Hillsong worship song Hosanna puts it, "Break my heart for what breaks yours, everything I am for your kingdom's cause." I said that Jesus doesn't limit himself to words of comfort, but rather takes risky sacrificial action. But before we look at what he does, we should stop to notice what he actually says, as his words don't appear to be comforting anyway. Verse 13 continues, "When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, 'Don't cry.'" But at a Jewish funeral in those days, weeping was exactly what you were supposed to do. If you remember the story of Jesus raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, the hired mourners were already wailing at the house when Jesus gets there to carry out the miracle. Telling the chief mourner in a burial procession not to cry was unheard of, not to mention how unsympathetic and unfeeling it sounds when we've just been considering how compassionate Jesus is. When we say, "Don't cry," it usually stems from our feelings of inadequacy in not knowing what to say or how to help, or guilt if we think we've caused the tears, or being uncomfortable with raw emotion on display. But we know Jesus was comfortable with crying because we read how he joined Lazarus' sisters in weeping at his tomb, and this lack of empathy in no way fits with the heart of compassion we know he has, so his words must have a different meaning. Let's imagine a different scenario where you might say, "Don't cry." For example, a baby is crying in its cot because it has dropped its comforter or toy over the side. So the parent says, "Don't cry," as he or she picks up the item and returns it to the infant. Or an older child is crying after a bad dream, and a parent says, "Don't cry," as they wipe their tears, give them a drink of water, and stroke their back till they return to sleep. In those instances, the words are not vain or empty. They are accompanied by action which demonstrates why tears are no longer needed. Jesus says, "Don't cry," because he hasn't walked all that way to intercept the burial procession just to see into the woman's situation, validate her in her grief and desperation. No, he's going to remove the need for her tears and transform her situation. Jesus is ready to weep with us in our times of sadness, loss, loneliness, despair. But he's also ready to shine his light into these dark times and bring change and transformation. And he promises us in Revelation 21 of the day when God will wipe every tear from our eyes, because there will be no more mourning or crying or pain. Back to our passage, and having shown his heart of compassion and uttered the meaning-laden words, "Don't cry," we'll now see that Jesus has power to transform. In verses 14 to 15 we read, "Then he went and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, 'Young man, I say to you, get up.' The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother." Here is a situation that seems so bleak, so desperate, so impossible. But Jesus is able to change it in an instant, to transform it with just a word. In the same way God could say, "Let there be light," and there was light, Jesus is able to say, "Let there be life," and life is restored. We should compare and contrast this with our other passage in 1 Kings, where God works through the prophet Elijah to restore life to the son of the widow of Zarephath. We read that Elijah stretched himself out on the boy 3 times, cried out to God for the boy's life to be restored, and then God answered the prophet's prayer, and life was miraculously restored. It's no wonder that the crowds around Jesus, having seen the widow of Nain's son restored to life, assume that Jesus also is a great prophet who has followed in Elijah's footsteps in performing such a miracle. But there are key differences. Elijah's miracle requires action alongside words, and repeated action at that. And he has to cry out to God in prayer for the restoration to take place. But Jesus has the power to bring instantaneous transformation and restoration just with his words. In the previous chapter, Luke recounts his equivalent of the Sermon on the Mount, where he quotes Jesus as saying, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." And now, just a few days later, we see Jesus' words fulfilled in this miracle. He has brought hope where there was only despair, light where there was only darkness, laughter and joy where there was only sorrow, life where there was only death. We might not face a situation as desperate and hopeless as the widow of Nain, but we all go through times of sorrow and despair, times when things feel insurmountable and hopeless. This miracle reminds us of Jesus' power to transform situations, to turn our weeping to laughter, that nothing is impossible with him. We know that God can bring miraculous change, but we also know that he might not bring the change we ask for, because he sees the bigger picture, and the transformation and restoration we need might not be the one we are craving in that moment. We have to trust the God of miracles with his plans to prosper each one of us. It's interesting to note that although Luke tells us that the young man sat up and started to speak, he doesn't bother to tell us anything that he said. Maybe, like the epitaph on the comedian Spike Milligan's gravestone, he said something like, "I told you I was ill." But Luke isn't bothered anyway, because what matters is that Jesus gave him back to his mother. That was the whole reason for the miracle. Jesus saw the mother's desperate need, was filled with compassion, and carried out the transformative restoration to stop her tears. Jesus calls on us to continue his work of transformation and restoration, to back up our compassion with a willingness to get our hands dirty. Like Elijah, God can use our sustained action and fervent prayer to bring hope to the hopeless. And speaking of hope, that brings us to our final point, that Jesus has hope to offer. Verses 16 to 17 conclude by saying, "They were all filled with awe and praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. We've already mentioned the crowd's understandable confusion about Jesus being a great prophet with the echoes of Elijah. But other than that, their reaction was pretty much spot on. They responded with awe and praise. They recognized God at work in Jesus to bring help to his people, and they spread the news about Jesus far and wide. But we have an advantage over those members of the crowd. Yes, they got to see a mind-blowing miracle in the flesh, but we are living in the light of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. This miracle they witnessed gave a foretaste of Jesus' authority over death and the resurrection life on offer, but it was a limited version. The young man would go on to die again, and his restoration to life was not an eternal resurrection. But we know that Jesus ultimately conquered death by his own death on the cross, and that his resurrection is confirmation of the victory he has won and the resurrection hope for each one of us. Do we, like the crowd, respond in awe and praise? Or have we grown dulled to this amazing gospel truth? And do our lives bear witness to that transforming hope so that we too play our part in spreading the good news far and wide? We started by considering our reaction to a funeral cortege, but let's take away with us Jesus' reaction to the burial procession he encountered. He had eyes to see, a heart of compassion, power to transform, and hope to offer. May we too be equipped and used by him to really see the overlooked, to suffer with them, and bring more of God's transforming love, light, and hope to those around us. Amen.